Elias Thorne didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to be unreachable. He grew up in the kind of crushing poverty that leaves a permanent, icy chill in the bones, a childhood defined by the hollow sound of an empty refrigerator and the burning shame of wearing worn-out shoes to school. This trauma became his primary engine, a desperate, white-hot fuel that burned more intensely than any ordinary ambition. He vowed that he would never be hungry, vulnerable, or small ever again. To Elias, money wasn't just a simple currency. It was a massive fortress, a thick wall of gold designed specifically to protect him from a world that had once treated him like an invisible ghost. The foundation of his empire was laid in a cramped, windowless apartment. He launched his first tech venture not with capital, but with a brutal trade. He exchanged his fleeting youth for endless lines of complex code. He traded restorative sleep for 4-hour naps on a caffeine-stained sofa, his mind never truly turning off. Meals were replaced by bitter, lukewarm coffee and neon energy drinks that kept his heart racing at an unnatural, frantic tempo. He convinced himself that basic human needs were merely design flaws to be optimized or ignored. By his 30s, the cracks in his armor began to show. Chronic migraines became a constant, cruel companion. A dull throb he silenced with handfuls of high-dose painkillers. Heart palpitations would occasionally seize his chest, making him lean heavily against his mahogany desk until the room stopped spinning. He called these physical warnings the price of greatness, a necessary tax on his climb to the very top. But the price was far steeper than his digital spreadsheet suggested. While his bank account surged into the stratosphere, his personal world became a sterile, echoing void. He was in a boardroom in Tokyo when his daughter was born, convinced that a massive trust fund was a far better gift than a father's presence. He was closing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition when his father was buried in the rain, justifying his absence by claiming he was finally providing the legacy his father never could. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. His friends were slowly replaced by opportunistic associates, and his genuine laughter by a cold, calculating silence that commanded respect but offered absolutely no warmth to those around him. By 45, Elias stood at the absolute pinnacle. He occupied a glass skyscraper that pierced the clouds, looking down at the city like a modern-day deity who had conquered mortality. He was a billionaire, invincible and untouchable, or so he believed as he ignored the numbness spreading through his left arm. The tremors in his hands were masked by the fine wool of tailored sleeves, and the grey, sickly pallor of his skin was disguised by expensive office lighting. The turning point arrived during the most significant board meeting of his career. He stood to finalize a merger that would cement his global dominance. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words dissolved into a terrifying metallic taste. The room tilted violently. The faces of his partners blurred into shadows as his body finally filed for bankruptcy, and he collapsed. He awoke in a world of white walls and the rhythmic mocking beep of life support machines. The specialist stood over him, holding a digital tablet that detailed the wreckage of Elias's biology. The diagnosis was a rare, stress-induced systemic failure, a condition where the body's internal systems simply ceased to function. It was the physical manifestation of 2 decades of absolute neglect. As Elias looked at the doctor, he realized the terrifying irony. He had all the money in the world, yet he couldn't buy a single moment of genuine peace or a single breath of ease. The doctor's voice was cold and clinical as he delivered the final, devastating blow. He looked Elias in the eyes and said the words that would haunt him. "You spent your life building a fortune you won't live to spend." Elias Thorne refused to believe the specialist's grim prognosis. In his mind, biology was just another complex system to be optimized, another bug in the code that a high enough investment could surely patch. Even as the IV drips hummed a rhythmic clinical tune, he attempted to manage his global empire from the confines of his hospital bed. He barked orders through a transparent oxygen mask, his voice raspy and thin, demanding status reports on the merger he had collapsed during. He truly believed that if he could just keep the numbers moving upward on a flickering screen, his vitals would eventually follow that same trajectory. He viewed his failing organs as disloyal employees that needed better management rather than a dying machine. Money had always been his ultimate shield, and he was prepared to hurl gold at the Reaper until the spectre blinked. But the Reaper didn't blink. It simply raised its price. The financial hemorrhage began as a trickle, then turned into a terrifying, unstoppable torrent. Elias realized that standard medicine was for the masses, so he sought the extraordinary. He converted his sprawling glass penthouse into a private, high-tech intensive care unit, a sanctuary of chrome and silicon that cost more per day than most families earned in a decade. He hired a rotating team of the world's most elite private doctors, professionals whose loyalty was bought with seven-figure retainers. Every shallow breath he took was now subsidized by a small army of specialists who monitored his cellular decay on glowing holographic displays. The elegant silence of his home was replaced by the constant, aggressive whirring of air filtration systems and the hiss of synthetic blood stabilizers. To fuel this insatiable medical machine, the liquidation of his life's vanity began in earnest. The fleet of vintage luxury cars, once symbols of his untouchable status, were the first to go. They were auctioned off in a frantic blur to anonymous collectors, their mechanical roar replaced by the cold, digital silence of bank transfers. Next was his private jet, the vessel that had allowed him to outrun time zones and competitors alike. He watched from his motorized bed as the Thorne logo was scrubbed from the aircraft's tail in a grainy video feed sent by his lawyers. It was a haunting, peculiar sensation, watching his carefully curated identity being stripped away piece by piece just to pay for the very air he struggled to inhale. As his physical world shrank to the size of a sterile room, the emotional void expanded. Elias looked for support but found only cold corporate echoes. His business partners, the men he had enriched and mentored, began to treat him like a toxic asset. They sent expensive flowers and generic cards, but their private communications were filled with questions about succession plans and shareholder stability. He was no longer the visionary leader. He was a liability to be managed. Desperate and isolated, Elias sought refuge at a remote, high-cost medical facility tucked deep within the Swiss Alps. The view of the jagged peaks served as a cruel mockery of the corporate heights he had once conquered. Here, the cost of staying stable surged to tens of millions of dollars a week. He was burning through his fortune at a rate that would have bankrupted a small nation. Yet his body continued to betray him with every agonizing heartbeat. The final blow came when his lead surgeon presented him with a brutal choice. There was a revolutionary, unproven procedure, a total systemic reset involving advanced gene therapy. It was his only hope, but the price tag was astronomical, requiring the entirety of his remaining liquid assets and the sale of his controlling interest in Thorne Enterprises. The company he had built from a windowless apartment, the legacy he had sacrificed his father's funeral and his daughter's childhood for, was now the only currency left to buy a few more years of life. His condition worsened by the hour, forcing him to accept the inevitable. With a trembling, withered hand, Elias finally signed the papers. He watched his life's work vanish with a signature, realizing he was trading his entire legacy for a 10% chance at survival. The signature on the final divestment papers felt heavier than any deal Elias Thorne had ever closed. It was the sound of a guillotine falling on a legacy that had taken 3 decades of sweat and sacrifice to build. Within weeks, his mansions with their heated marble floors and panoramic city views were sold to the highest bidders. Their cavernous rooms emptied of the art collections he had curated for status rather than beauty. Rare canvases were crated away, leaving ghostly outlines on the walls where his ego once hung. Every cent from the sale of Thorne Enterprises, the company he had birthed in a windowless apartment, was funneled into his final grueling sequence of surgeries. The man who once commanded the city was now a man of paper, his entire existence reduced to a series of medical bills. As anesthesia took hold for the final procedure, the world of ledgers and profit margins dissolved into a blinding soft light. In the depth of his unconsciousness, Elias did not see the glass skyscrapers or the cheering crowds of shareholders. Instead, he saw a kitchen bathed in the amber glow of a Saturday morning. He saw his daughter as a toddler, her laughter echoing against simple wooden walls, and his father, healthy and whole, leaning against a porch railing. In this vision, there were no clocks to race. He realized with a soul-aching clarity that he had spent his life chasing a shadow while the sun was already shining behind him. He saw a life measured in connection rather than commas in a bank balance, a vision of simple love that no gold could ever manufacture. He woke not to the high-tech hum of a Swiss clinic, but to a public hospital ward smelling of floor wax and cheap disinfectant. There were no private nurses, only the distant sound of a television and the steady breathing of 3 other patients sharing his space. His fortune was gone, vanished into the machinery of his survival, yet for the first time in 20 years, his hands did not tremble. The crushing weight in his chest had been replaced by a fragile, tentative lightness. He was penniless, a ghost of the titan he had once been, but his heart beat with a steady, rhythmic defiance. He had survived the liquidation of his life and had finally settled the debt with his own body. Recovery was a slow, humble education in humanity. Elias moved into a modest 1-bedroom apartment in a quiet corner of the city, a space smaller than his former walk-in closet. He learned to perform the basic tasks he had once delegated to a small army of staff. He learned how to cook a simple meal without checking his phone and how to walk to the corner store without a security detail. Every step was a victory over the atrophy of his former existence. His world was small, but vivid. He noticed the way morning light hit the bricks of the neighboring building and the sharp taste of a crisp apple. The billionaire had died on that operating table, leaving behind a man who was finally learning how to live. Reconnecting with his daughter was the hardest hurdle of all. When they finally met in a local park, he did not bring a checkbook or promises of an inheritance. He brought only a sincere apology and a request for a simple walk. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, the silence heavy with years of neglect. He did not talk about the company or the boardrooms. He talked about the sunset and the way the trees were turning gold. He asked about her life, listening with an intensity once reserved for multi-billion-dollar mergers. For the first time, he was not looking at his watch. He was simply present in the fragile, beautiful reality of a shared moment. Passing a newsstand one afternoon, Elias saw the new CEO of Thorne Enterprises on a magazine cover, a young, hungry man with dark circles under his eyes and a predatory smile. Elias felt a sudden pang of pity rather than envy. He saw the same frantic, hollow energy that had nearly consumed him. He realized his current poverty was infinitely richer than his former wealth. Sitting on a park bench as the sun dipped below the horizon, he had no empire to manage, only a second chance. He took a deep, clear breath of the evening air, realizing he had spent everything to buy the one thing money could never own, the peace of a life lived in the present. He watched the light fade and knew that true prosperity was not found in a vault, but in the simple ability to be still. He was finally at peace with the true value of life, a price paid in full and without regret.